single greatest challenge in human history, the greatest challenge our species has ever faced is this: can we sustainably and nutritiously feed the 9 billion people who will be on our planet by the year 2046, 30 years from now? And can we do it as we face factors like climate volatility, water scarcity, endemic diseases like Ebola and Zika, and the challenges of terrorism, political instability, refugee migration? Now, I'm probably the most improbable person, given my background, to be here talking to you about this. I was born in the Bronx, and when I was 10 years old, I was taken by my parents to the Middle West and ended up in Dubuque, Iowa, so I was a city kid. I had absolutely no interest in agriculture, farming, or anything like that. When I passed the Foreign Service exam and was on my way to Washington, D.C. to become a State Department officer, visions of diplomatic sugar plums danced through my head. I mean, I was going to be in chandeliered ballrooms in London, Paris, Vienna if I had to, sipping aperitifs, discussing the nuances of international affairs with other diplomats. You know, being from Dubuque, I didn't know what an aperitif was, but I thought that sounded very fancy. And when I got to the State Department, I was in for a shock. When I went in to talk about my assignment, they said, well, you're under 26, eligible for the draft, you're single, you're male, you haven't been in the military. And before I knew what happened, they assigned me to Vietnamese language training. And a year later, I'm in the back of a single-engine plane landing on a dirt road in the Mekong Delta. They didn't even stop the engine. They just opened the door. I got out, they threw my bag after me, and they said, we'll be back in 18 months, and if you're still alive, we'll pick you up, and it'll be on to the rest of your career. But it was in the 8 villages I worked in the Mekong Delta, that I learned the great lesson of my life. Having taken that wrong turn, I would find the right road for me. Now, to understand what I experienced, you have to understand what was going on in the world in terms of global agriculture in the mid-1960s. Who's ever heard of Norman Borlaug? Put your hands up. Yeah, I didn't think so. So if nothing else you remember from what I say, I want you to remember that Norman Borlaug is the greatest American agricultural scientist, probably the greatest agricultural scientist in the history of the world. It's the man of whom it is said he saved 1 billion lives. He has saved more lives than any other person who has ever lived. And he did this because, and that fact that he's from Northeast Iowa is not biasing or prejudicing my comments, but he went to Mexico, and for 20 years, working there with the poorest farmers, developed miracle wheat. And in the mid-1960s, as India and Pakistan faced imminent mass starvation, famine, likely hundreds of millions of deaths, Borlaug goes there, flies back and forth between those two countries as they're at war, shooting at each other, and convinces both political leaders to adapt his new seeds, his approach to agriculture. And the Green Revolution is born because they go from anticipated deficits to self-sufficiency to exports in just 4 or 5 years. Borlaug is proclaimed the father of the Green Revolution, and in 1970 is called to Oslo to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. It's in my opinion, in terms of life accomplishments, probably the single greatest graduate of any land-grant college or institution since Justin Morrill had the idea for them in 1862 and Abraham Lincoln the good sense to sign the legislation that created the greatest assemblage of agricultural scientists the world has ever known. So now back in Vietnam in 1968, I had these 8 villages, and the Green Revolution was coming to Vietnam in terms of something called IR8 rice. And like Borlaug's wheat, it would dramatically increase yields, cut growing times, resist disease, and so could take farmers from being subsistence to having surplus, which could help them lift their families out of poverty. And agricultural advisors were coming to my 8 villages to encourage farmers to use the IR8 rice. Now, at the same time, by coincidence, just by chance, we had a USAID project to upgrade the old French farm-to-market road that went through all 8 villages. And by that time, we had finished the road through 4 of the villages, and the other was still, the road was in terrible, terrible shape. And as I drove through my 8 villages where I was an advisor, I observed that it was only in the villages that had the improved road where farmers started using the IR8 rice. And the change was dramatic. It was incredible. Almost overnight, farmers went from having surplus so they could now improve their homes. Their families were better dressed. Their children more well-nourished. Child mortality went down because now moms with sick kids could get out on the road to get medical help. The combination of the roads and the new miracle rice undercut the Viet Cong guerrillas that we were fighting. The insurgency evaporated. What we couldn't do with boots on the ground and bombs and military operations, we accomplished through this amazing agricultural and infrastructure enhancement. That was the lesson I had learned. I had to go to Vietnam to learn it, but I should have known it, and all of you should know it because it is the lesson that transformed America. The Middle West, where I'm from, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, they all were changed by building those farm-to-market roads so that the agricultural research from the land-grant universities could get out to farmers, so new companies developing new products could get out to them. That's what made America what it is today, but we've forgotten the lesson. It was the idea. It's why every land-grant institution has a college of agriculture and a college of engineering. Because in the 1860s, it was understood how the two went together and what impact they produced. And so, seeing that, I had received my orders. I was going to be assigned to go to Harvard. I was going to be trained in labor relations, and I had my assignment. Western Europe, my dream was going to come true. And I wrote to the State Department and said, I don't want to go to Harvard. I don't want to study labor relations. I don't want to go to Western Europe. I want to stay in Vietnam. Now, these days, if there's such clear indication of mental instability, they usually bring you right home to Washington. But they were desperate for guys to stay in Vietnam, and so they approved that, and I ended up staying for 6 years, and it changed the course of my life. Now, fast forward to 2009. I'm now a more senior State Department officer dealing with Cambodia. Cambodia, which had suffered under the incredible draconian rule of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, that had taken the lives of 2 million of the 7 million people in the country in just 4 years. And there were still 25,000 Khmer Rouge all over the countryside. How do we get rid of them? I had $11 million of your taxpayer money. And I used it. I called in the AID officers and I said, go to Thailand, find all the road grading equipment you can, bring it here and start improving the roads out into these Khmer Rouge areas. And it's like fighting cancer. The Khmer Rouge were the tumor. The roads are like your blood vessels. And the agricultural technology is the chemotherapy that you send to confront and attack and destroy the tumor. 9 years later, as I was getting set to leave Cambodia, having been the U.S. ambassador there, my phone rang. It was the Prime Minister. He wanted to tell me that the last Khmer Rouge had just surrendered. We had eradicated the worst genocidal, mass-murdering terrorist organization of the second half of the 20th century using that Norman Borlaug formula of roads and agricultural technology, roads and rice, roads and wheat. Now, I retired. I went back to Iowa, to Des Moines. I became head of the World Food Prize that Borlaug had created. He created it to be a Nobel Prize for food and agriculture, and I was going to meet him for the first time. So you can imagine, I was scared. Here I'm going to meet this Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and he's going to think I'm some fancy pants of feet diplomat. So I'm meeting him, and I'm telling him the story as fast as I can. Oh, I was in villages during the Green Revolution, and roads and rice. And he goes, roads? I thought I was about to be fired before I even started the job. And he said, roads, you're absolutely right. That's the lesson. That's what made the difference. That's what allowed my miracle wheat to get out to people. That's what transforms rural areas. And so we had this bond that kept us together. And I have used the World Food Prize and all our programs to promote these ideas. 2008, I was with Secretary of Defense Bob Gates and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And we're talking about global food security and national security. And I'm telling them the story about being in the villages and roads and rice and the impact of the improved roads. And Bob Gates stops me and he said, every one of my commanders in Afghanistan says the same thing. Where the road ends, the insurgency begins. 2013, I was invited to address the United Nations on World Food Day. And I'm telling them these stories. And I said, look, Africa, South Asia, going to be facing 2 billion additional people to be fed. I said, take the world hunger map and put it up on the wall. And you'll see the shaded areas of malnutrition, poverty, and hunger. Put on top of it the world conflict map. And you'll see that the shaded areas of terrorism and instability and conflict and military action are almost all coterminous. And then if you can find it, put the world rural roads and highway map on top of those two, and you will see that where the road ends is where poverty, malnutrition, and hunger, and instability, and political conflict, and terrorism, and human rights abuses all begin. Now, the World Food Prize also in agriculture is about promoting peace. In 2012, we gave our $250,000 prize that we give each year to an Israeli irrigation scientist, an Israeli Jew, who had been nominated for our prize by 3 Muslim scientists from 3 Arab and Muslim countries. And the Secretary General of the United Nations came to Des Moines to help present our prize to Daniel Hillel. And in the audience are Arab sheikhs, Muslim princesses, Israeli diplomats. Food and agriculture and confronting hunger can bring people together across even the broadest divides. Dr. Borlaug died in 2009. In 2014, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of his birth. In the U.S. Capitol on March 25th, we unveiled his statue. And sitting there together are Speaker John Boehner and Nancy Pelosi, Senator Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell, and they're all being nice to each other. I mean, how many people can do that, right? In Mexico, farmers erected Borlaug's statue, paid for by themselves. In India, Indian scientists put it up. In Uganda, his last words, "Take it to the farmer," were the theme for their agricultural fair. And that summer, I received an invitation to go and attend another commemorative ceremony for him from the Agricultural Biotechnology Research Institute of Iran. And they wanted to know how could they buy a copy of that statue of Borlaug and put it up on their campus. And they invited me to come. And I thought, they'll never let me in. I'm a former diplomat. They'll think I'm some sort of CIA spy. But they gave me a visa. I went and I addressed an audience of about 400 Iranian scientists, the Minister of Agriculture, the mullah representing the Grand Ayatollah, and I told them the stories of Iowa and how at the most dangerous moment in human history, 1959, when nuclear weapons were poised to be fired at each other by the Soviet Union and the United States, Premier Khrushchev came to Iowa, visited a farm, and that led to an agricultural exchange. And I explained how that could be the same process. The United States and Iran, I invited them to send a scientist to Des Moines, which they did, be part of that. Not negotiating anything about nuclear issues, but providing some modicum, some moment of understanding. So as we look, how do we lift 2 billion people out of poverty, hunger, and malnutrition? Norman Borlaug, agriculture, agricultural research, and institutions provide the best answer.